Hey guys, it's towniesimbuilds here, and welcome back to another episode of The Sims 4 Real Lore. In this series, we dive into fascinating destinations from around the world, shrouded in history, mystery, and sometimes a little bit of spookiness. Today's tale takes us into one of the spookiest sites in all of Mexico, the Isla de las Munecas, or Island of Dolls. While being a highly popular tourist attraction, the haunted past and existence of the Island of Dolls is not without several mysteries surrounding its inception, along with the rumored hauntings that continue to this very day. Before diving into today's video, I do want to note that this episode will cover topics regarding the supernatural and paranormal. We will also discuss the mysterious circumstances regarding the death of a child, so please keep that in mind while watching. On another note, I am not fully versed in Spanish or native languages. However, I will do my best to pronounce these different names for you guys. Starting off today's tale, we travel to a borough of Mexico known as Xochimilco, located south of Mexico's capital, Mexico City. Historically, Xochimilco is home to an ancient system of canals, which date back to the native Aztec people. This area was a site of extensive agriculture, which led to the development of chinampas that still exist today. By definition, chinampas are described as artificial islands, created over time using a system of woven reeds and fences, placed within the waters of Xochimilco. Traditionally, the Aztecs would compile soil on top of these raft-like structures, building what some would call floating islands. These floating islands would allow for extensive crop growth, made possible by the lake's nutrient-rich sediment. This practice, which is still used today, makes Xochimilco a protected ecological and World Heritage Site under UNESCO, also known as the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Despite the fascinating history of Xochimilco's land, a mysterious tale would ingrain itself within the lakes and marshes of the borough forever. Roughly in the mid-1950s, a local man by the name of Don Julian Santana Barrera would relocate from a nearby town, settling into the wooded, watery area of Xochimilco's canals. Reportedly, Don Julian had been married with a family of his own. However, his origins and ensuing story bring many questions. We have no information regarding Don Julian's profession prior to moving to the canals. Unfortunately, the identity of his wife is also unknown. Likewise, we do not have any definite information regarding the identities of his children. We do not have names, ages, or even the exact amount of kids he did have with his wife. However, several decades later, we do know that Don Julian was survived by his nephews, including Rogelio Sanchez Santana, who would later become the caretaker of the Isla de las Munecas. But with that said, we will get into Rogelio's accounts later on in this tale. Now, moving forward, I do want to note that based on multiple accounts, Don Julian may not have been mentally stable at the time of his departure. Unfortunately, we can't exactly confirm what Don Julian may have been experiencing at this time. However, these reports may tie into future events that will unfold. Ultimately, Don Julian would abandon his wife and children, moving to the canals of Xochimilco. There, he would live on an island on what is currently known as 𝗪𝗪𝗏 Lake, spending the remainder of his life as a hermit. Based on multiple sources and photographs of the Isla de las Munecas, Don Julian lived in what appear to be small, makeshift huts that are widely pictured by tourists and journalists alike. Unfortunately, it is likely that Don Julian lived off-grid, having no access to electricity or filtered water in his new home, with no one else living in the vicinity of the island. To this day, there is no clear reason as to why Don Julian left his wife and children, or why Don Julian had chosen the wooded wetlands of Xochimilco's canals as his new home. However, his story only becomes more mysterious. Reportedly, one day while living on the island near 𝗪𝗪𝗏 Lake, Don Julian makes a tragic yet very unsettling discovery. At the edge of the island where Don Julian resided, he discovered the lifeless body of a young girl, who appeared to have been tangled in water lilies. Based on Don Julian's account, the young girl had died as a result of accidental drowning. Don Julian's great-nephew, Rogelio, shed further light on this incident, provided by an interview with New York Post. Based on his retelling of his uncle's account, the young girl had actually been swimming in the canals with other young women, presumed to be sisters or friends. Unfortunately, unable to escape the current, the young girl had become separated from her companions, and ultimately drowned. Don Julian's note regarding the water lilies could further explain the young girl's death. In an attempt to swim out of the current's pull, she likely may have become trapped within the long underwater stalks of the water lilies themselves. Despite this report, we are still left with many unanswered questions regarding the young girl herself. The identity of the girl remains unknown and unconfirmed. We have no exact name, age, or any family that claimed her body, even though she was said to be with companions in the canals. In fact, some speculate that the discovery of the young girl's body may have never actually occurred, especially given Don Julian's supposed mental instability. As a result, some theorize that perhaps the young girl's death was merely a vivid hallucination. Adding to this theory, we have no confirmed place of burial for the young girl's body, nor do we have an official death report or death certificate. However, there is also no indication that Don Julian himself buried the young girl on the island. Despite the large amount of missing information, many sources verify that Don Julian did in fact place a cross at the precise location he had originally discovered the young girl's body. Recent photographs indicate that the cross is still intact on the island, where it is situated next to a small plaque. Unfortunately, at this point in our story, things take an even darker turn for Don Julian, who remained on the island at 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗚 Lake after the discovery of the young girl. Following her tragic death, Don Julian would make a very chilling statement, suggesting that the young girl never fully left the island. In fact, Don Julian claimed to hear her voice, screaming a phrase that would change both Don Julian and the island of 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗚 Lake forever. "Quiero mi muñeca," or "I want my doll." While some believe these words were a figment of delusion, more recent sources confirm that Don Julian's words were not sole hallucinations. Another descendant of Don Julian, great-nephew Javier Romero Santana, provides an interesting yet unsettling account as one of the island's caretakers. Reportedly, on multiple occasions, Javier and a co-worker scoped the island at night while waiting for tourists to arrive. Despite being the only two individuals present on the island, they often hear the moaning or crying of an unnamed young woman. On another note, the haunting phrase of "I want my doll" brings up a very important yet highly debated detail that accompanies the tragic event that unfolded. Reportedly, upon discovering the young girl, Don Julian claimed that a doll was found in close proximity to the girl's body. It likely had washed onto the shores of 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗚's island, following the current that took the young girl's life. Interestingly, if this detail is true, along with the alleged words of the young girl's spirit, the doll may have been the last toy the young girl was playing with prior to her death. Alternatively, it could also provide more possible explanations as to how the young girl died. One theory suggests that the young girl had actually dropped her doll into the canal, possibly playing on the shores of one of the chinampas or artificial islands. Upon trying to retrieve the doll in the canal's waters, she unfortunately perished in the currents. Another possibility is that the young girl had been playing with the doll while swimming in the canals. At some point, the current took hold of her alongside her doll, and ultimately both landed in the same location along the shore of Don Julian's island. With these possible explanations in mind, there is one account that tells a more heroic tale of Don Julian, provided by tour guide José Gabriel González Franco. A longtime resident of Xochimilco, José recalled Don Julian from his childhood, recounting the day of this tragedy. His account claims that Don Julian witnessed the young girl drowning as she approached the shores of the island. As a result, Don Julian rushed into the water in an attempt to save her life. However, his efforts were unfortunately in vain. While we will never truly know what happened to this poor girl, Don Julian would become extremely fearful and paranoid in the many years following her death. Reportedly, Don Julian began seeing shadowy figures on the island. Claiming to be haunted by her voice and her unsettling presence on the island, the ghostly words of the young girl echoed loudly, transforming the island of 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗚 Lake into the true Isla de las Munecas. Now, at this point in our tale, I do want to note that there are not any reports of Don Julian actually seeing an apparition of the young girl's spirit. However, following the young girl's death, it is rumored that other unsettling spiritual presences may have surfaced on the island itself. In fact, the canals themselves hold a much darker past, unknown to many visitors outside of the country. As a brief historical overview, the Aztec Empire originally held ownership over the Xochimilco canals. However, the Aztecs would fall in the early 1500s, defeated by the Spanish conquistadors led by Hernán Cortés. Unfortunately, like many wars, this was not one without bloodshed. Many surviving Aztecs fled to the wooded areas of the canals, seeking refuge from the Spanish. However, at the hands of the conquistadors themselves, or from fear of living under their rule, the remaining Aztecs did in fact perish, dying in the canals themselves. Some theorize that the death of the young girl may have spurred spiritual activity within Xochimilco's canals, as if reawakening the ghosts of centuries past. Unfortunately, if this is true, this surge of eerie activity may have greatly impacted Don Julian's life, affecting his time on the island for several more decades. In efforts to appease the young girl's spirit, Don Julian supposedly retrieved the girl's doll from the shore of the island, hanging it outside on a nearby tree. This action alone would spur one of hundreds, perhaps even thousands, of dolls that would become a part of the island itself. Unfortunately, due to Don Julian's fear of the girl's spirit, he searched endlessly through the streets and trash cans of nearby towns, seeking dolls of all kinds. Eerily enough, a majority of the dolls he brought back to the island were old, forgotten baby dolls, often in very poor and terrifying states of condition. A majority of the dolls were covered in dirt, decaying in mold, and or sometimes even partially burned, as if retrieved from an old fire. Most dolls were also found with missing limbs and other various body parts detached. However, Don Julian was indiscriminate. At times, he would even bring back doll arms or doll heads by themselves, hanging them alongside other dolls in the trees, fences, abandoned boats, and ropes hung throughout the island. Eerily enough, some say that additional dolls were actually retrieved from Xochimilco's canals, the same waters where the young girl had died. While some argue that Don Julian was desperate and collected any doll in any condition to appease the young girl's spirit, many speculate that the broken, decrepit dolls were purposely chosen by Don Julian. The jarring sight of these dolls was intended to scare away her spirit, potentially warding off other unsettling and potentially dark entities that began to haunt Don Julian following her death. In some accounts of Don Julian's story, he had become so plagued by harmful supernatural activity that the crops he grew on the island also perished unexplainably. For a period of time, he found himself unable to regrow his crops, and became gravely worried about this misfortune. While most sources indicate that Don Julian was of Catholic faith, some theorize that his vast collection of dolls was part of a mystical or superstitious method, designed to protect himself from unwanted paranormal entities. Don Julian's methods, although not fully understood, may be comparable to the ancient Celtic origins of Halloween, rooted in the traditions of the Samhain festival. Participants wore elaborate masks and costumes, sometimes donning the image of dark spirits to conceal themselves and ward off otherworldly presences. The mangled dolls of Don Julian may have served a similar purpose, regardless of their true effect or lack thereof. Likewise, some very strange inconsistencies do arise when researching the Isla de las Munecas, with some sources indicating that Don Julian did not collect all the dolls alone. In fact, there are some very odd alleged claims from Don Julian himself. In some instances, Don Julian stated that more dolls would seemingly appear on the island apart from his own efforts to collect them. Unfortunately, we don't know if there is any validity to these claims. However, they could suggest that locals may have contributed to Don Julian's collection. On a more serious note, however, these claims could also allude to heightened paranormal activity. Alternatively, they may suggest Don Julian's mental state, which may have become negatively impacted given the events he experienced. Some sources, however, paint a much more benevolent picture of Don Julian's tale following the death of the young girl. According to some accounts, Don Julian began his doll collection as a way to honor the young girl's spirit, beginning with the original doll that had washed ashore on the island of 𝗪𝗪𝗄 Lake. Unfortunately, what were originally good intentions turned into a very unhealthy obsession. Some locals that have been acquainted with Don Julian claim that he believed the dolls to be possessed, who demanded him to acquire more dolls in order to appease them. This theory could also explain the varying states of the dolls themselves, which Don Julian acquired without much discretion, valuing the quantity of the dolls over their current condition. Despite the mysteries behind why Don Julian collected these dolls, his efforts would continue for a period of roughly 17 years, according to tour guide González Franco. Reportedly, apart from abandoned dolls he found throughout the area, Don Julian also traded vegetables he grew on the island, obtaining more dolls from local residents and using them as a form of payment. While the island's doll collection grew, He also began allowing tourists to visit the island for a very small fee. While the doll served a more eerie purpose for Don Julian, one doll in particular did become a favorite of his. This doll, which Don Julian named Augustinita, is located on a small decorative altar within the doll shrine, a collection housed within one of Don Julian's huts. According to local lore, this doll was actually said to be a beacon of hope and good faith for Don Julian, one that was said to grant miracles and even provide healing. Unfortunately, this doll was said to be Don Julian's only companion, as he dwelled on the island as a hermit for the remainder of his life. Although he never returned to his original family, one of his nephews, Anastasio Santana, reportedly came to the island in 2001, assisting Don Julian with his crops. Unfortunately, however, his visit would end tragically, culminating in the death of Don Julian himself. After completing work in the yard, he searched for his uncle throughout the island, only to find his body in the canals, roughly in the same location as the young girl who had perished decades prior. Due to the very shocking and unsettling circumstances of Don Julian's death, many theorize that something supernatural really was to blame, affecting both Don Julian and the rest of the island on 𝗪𝗪𝗡 Lake. Some theorize that his death was caused by the spirit of the young girl, who some believe to be vengeful. This may have been a negative reaction to Don Julian, who ultimately was unable to save her from drowning. Others suggest that older spirits, presumably the Aztec victims of the conquistadors, may have had something to do with this malevolence. One haunting element in this tale, of course, are the hundreds to thousands of dolls on the island itself. In fact, Anastasio Santana claimed that on the day he discovered his uncle Don Julian dead, he witnessed several doll heads strung around the island turn and whisper, almost as if reacting to his uncle's tragic passing. As creepy and fantastical as this claim may be, the concept of possessed dolls is not new to fiction or reality, especially given the vast history of dolls from ancient civilization to modern day. While commonly known as children's toys, dolls throughout history have also held high spiritual value, often used in various rites of passage, rituals, religious ceremonies, magic, and even witchcraft. In fact, dolls throughout African, Asian, European, and Native American cultures have been known to be both totems of luck and prosperity, but also harbingers of misfortune in some incarnations. In present-day paranormal investigations, the phenomenon of haunted dolls has been confirmed, with certain popular cases including Annabelle and Robert the Doll. Both dolls have been well documented, noted for their high levels of paranormal and sometimes malevolent activity. By this standard, it is possible that the dolls that Don Julian gathered served as vessels for the lost spirits of the canal, including the young girl, the restless spirits of the Aztecs, and or other spiritual entities surrounding the waters of Xochimilco. Unfortunately, we can only speculate on the circumstances regarding Don Julian's life. Was the island truly haunted? And did the spirits surrounding the island negatively affect Don Julian's well-being? Or was Don Julian's obsession with the dolls and his fear of alleged supernatural entities heavily rooted in mental illness, an ailment that, unfortunately, had gone undiagnosed or untreated? Could his tragic tale be the result of both, as many believe it to be? The mysteries of Don Julian and the Isla de las Munecas remain unanswered to this day, with the many versions of Xochimilco's tale and the accounts provided by his descendants being the only remnants of this eerie local lore. Alright guys, and that is a wrap on the tale of Don Julian and the haunting backstory of the Isla de las Munecas, located in Xochimilco, Mexico. Now, on a very special note, the Isla de las Munecas is in fact open and available to the public. So if you are brave enough to explore the haunted abandoned dolls, you can actually do so. You'll actually begin with a ride on the canal, riding a traditional Mexican trajinera, which is very similar to a gondola. Once you arrive on the island, you can actually tour the huts where Don Julian used to live, and even see the original altar or shrine to both the young girl and also the one within the hut itself. Now, on a very important note, I do want to say that this build is not 100% accurate. It was a little tricky looking at a lot of the photo references, so overall this build is probably my best approximation of what it looks like in real life. Just like always, this build is still a no CC, no mod limited pack build, and will be available on the Sims 4 gallery for download. I'll leave you guys now with the final cinematic shots of the build, along with the lot specs as well. And, just like always, this has been towniesimbuilds, signing off. Thank you so much for watching, guys.